Hey you guys. Okay, so Mr. and I decided to come back and do a live with you guys titled MLK Day, a Liberal Defecation Day. I believe that's the whole title. So I want to discuss this. This will be a different angle from some of the other conversations we've had about MLK. I'm going to let Mr. kind of guide the direction of the conversation. I think this is going to be an interesting discussion.
Okay, is that my cue?
Yeah, babe, that's your cue.
Okay. Hello everyone. Hopefully you're doing well. So MLK Day, or properly known as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The day is observed on, of course, we know his birthday was actually on January the 15th, but this Monday is the day, the federal holiday um, that's observed. And everybody's off and everyone's having MLK festivities, whether it's breakfast, prayer breakfast, whether it's marches, whether it's, some type of assemblies, so on and so forth, just to show their support for the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And, it's really a liberal kumbaya time. And personally, it makes me want to throw up in my own mouth because it's disingenuous. We get Negroes and allies, all eyes coming together really to celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. King, but we keep him in that kind of pacifist, kind of like that liberal, nonviolence Dr. King early on in his life. Not the more radical Dr. King at the end of his life that was positioning um, really social justice, looking at poverty, looking at economics, right? Looking at the war in Vietnam. So looking at all these different things and really second guessing his whole stance about just merely looking at integration, right? Just kind of second guessing some of that work. But we often want to keep him caught here. And not only do we use his earlier rhetoric, but we hijack it with our identity politics and the things that we think are important today. For example, I went to an event, a local event. Again, I said I wanted to throw up in my own mouth because it had a march, which I don't get why we're marching in 2020. What the hell is the march for other than symbolism? So within that march, of course, you had the Rainbow Coalition that was there, and you have white males walking with signs that said "Don't shoot" and that I'm not a threat. And for me, I just found that very annoying, and it angered me because I do a lot of research on black males, and white male doesn't have that same reality that black males face on a daily basis, just leaving our own homes. So to make that juxtaposition was very, very problematic. In addition to that, you know, the local NAACP really wanted to talk about, I guess they wanted to encapsulate the the um, the women's movement, right? And they wanted to look at and recognize what they call sisters of the movement. But it's really dangerous when you are equating, black women or women of color with, suffragists, the likes of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who are blatant racists and who, opposed the 15th Amendment because they didn't want black men to have the right to vote. So, I mean, there's a great article by Brett Staples. Um, I think it's New York Times, 2018, where he goes into details about how actually there was a huge bifurcation between black suffragists and white suffragists, and how really the white suffragists they were really trying to keep, racism and white supremacy at foot. I mean, and the history hasn't changed today. I mean, you go back to the last election where white women, um, I think it was roughly between 47%. I know the going number was like 52 to 53% of white women um, voted for Donald Trump. So they're not going to separate themselves for their ideological base and what's going to be best for them. And so when I look at, you know, the pageantries of today, and I say we're off base here, because after everyone goes home from this march and the celebratory event, and everyone's really happy that black and white folks are here together, I mean, the reality doesn't change. I mean, I'm not expecting things to happen overnight, but we're not having a really sincere argument or our demands, right? I mean, so the fact that you have, white folks coming here doing the keynote, and you're celebrating a lot of women, the majority are white women, and I get it's a state that's not full of a lot of people of color.
And it's an
But
NAACP event, right?
well, yeah, but I mean, this is just, I just found the whole thing sickening. But this is not just a one-time thing. This is something that we do all the time. And so it's very interesting that, it happens around this time, January. Of course, we celebrate Dr. King, which I'm not knocking that. I just think the ways in which we celebrate him are really, I think we really are very hypocritical in the way we support and with the way we celebrate his life and legacy. And then we go right into February, of course, what we know is African American History Month. And then after that, we celebrate women. And a lot of times people, wrap those up together. One of the things I want to say, I'll get off my diatribe, is problematic, especially with this recognition of, the women's suffrage movement. And I already articulated how racist a lot of these, initial suffragists were. And if you look at the feminist movement, it's still pretty much the case. It's not that they have any altruistic or well-being desire for black women, because again, look at the situation back in the 60s and even before then. Before the 60s, black women were what? They didn't really care about black women because black women were the ones cleaning up their homes. They were the ones taking care of their babies, right? So it wasn't like they were really altruistically concerned with, women and all women. No, they were concerned with white women. And so what this does, and people don't understand, that it causes this bifurcation between black men and black women. Because when you're saying, it's a different orientation. So if I say, hey, I'm celebrating my sister or our sisters and everything, and usually what should happen, our sisters would say, hey, we are acknowledging our men and vice versa. But that tends not to happen as much in the black community anymore. It seems, as I feel, is intentional, that black women are given the praise. And I'm not saying that they don't deserve it, but we know a lot of black women are intentionally put in these places to further the bifurcation between men and to make it seem as men aren't doing crap. In some cases, that may be the reality, right? But what we're not shrewd and smart enough to know is that this is by design. So even our smartest sisters, and I've seen them, they always, even if they're men, and I'm not blasting brothers, but even, let's take, for example, even if their men aren't crap, they're going to make sure they acknowledge their brother. But oftentimes that's not the case. We have sisters come up there and they think they've done it on their own merit, and that's not the case. There's been some sacrifices, whether it's from other brothers or other sisters, but they didn't make it to where they are by their own merit. And this is the thing that I think is sensationalized. And when we just really hyper focus on our women and not the black community in general. And I know that sounds hypocritical for a person that studies and centers black male, but I do that not with the end result of the black men, but as a conduit into the black community and the black family. Because in any other society, and this may sound misogynistic or it may sound something, people are going to take out of context and say, oh, well, you're chauvinistic. But men are generally the people at the head. And that's the case, that might not be the case in all matters, but generally speaking, when we look at every, you know, ethnic background, the men are at the foundation, and our women are important as well. But when we look at the Black community, the women are the ones deemed as the backbone of the community of our race and everything. And that's not the shortcut, um, their support, and even sometimes them stepping up and doing things that brothers should be doing. But again, that's recognized only, I feel, in the Black community. You look in the Latinx community, you look in the Asian, Pacific Islander, the indigenous, and everything. You don't see that. You get the recognition of the men, and it's vice versa. So, what I see with us, it's not as much as a complementarianism. It's not complimentary. It's more divisive. Those Negroes ain't crap. That's why these sisters have to do all this. And I look in all the other areas of the spectrum, and I see it's more of us getting along together, women and men. And so I think we have to be careful when we're celebrating Dr. King, because I think often it allows us to project a lot of these bifurcations, a lot of these false narratives, a lot of these identity politics. I mean, you can go into the LGBTQ, where that community begins to co-opt, the life and legacy of Dr. King. And again, not trying to be exclusionary for our Black brothers and sisters, regardless of their orientation, but I'm saying that identity politics becomes, more important than, what the majority of Black people are going through. We're not talking about things that are cross, you know, that cross orientations like education and economics and jobs and how we're getting treated by police, housing, so on and so forth. Those are real, those are real subject areas, right? But we're caught up on who gets recognition and an identity politics. So again, I know that was a whole lot, but all this to me, I saw within this latest incident of celebrating Dr. King, and I'm just like, where do we go from here? Community or chaos? And to me, it seems like we're in a lot of chaos.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about just the dynamic of this situation where you have the NAACP, which is historically set up to help and uplift Black people, turning Martin Luther King Day into something that's about the suffrage movement, into something that's about gay rights, into something where you have white people marching with signs that typically we see on Black people, like the don't shoot signs, and kind of the morphing of Martin Luther King's birthday celebration into something that is more suited that is more suited to pushing various liberal agendas than it has anything whatsoever to do with anything Martin Luther King was talking about. And I just find that very interesting. It's almost like the history of it doesn't matter. But I want to talk a little bit about something, because everybody knows my feelings on Martin Luther King. So I want to talk a little bit about something like a lot of people push this today. So earlier today, Mr. doesn't know this because I wasn't bugging him and he was doing that NAACP thing, the march that didn't serve a purpose that they threw. But earlier today, I was talking about how the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King has been greatly distorted, and this peaceful legacy that he has put out that was based on the teachings of Gandhi, who in fact believed in violence, which was rooted in the Indian Revolution, wherein there was violence, and the Bible, which also believes in violence, how that has been smoothed over, and the legacy of King is just peace, 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 hugs and kisses. Allow yourself to be tortured, knocked over, they'll come around. And so a lot of people were trying to give me pushback, which I didn't address, but I would love to address here, with like, what were the final stages that he was in? Because I think like you and I will agree, but then we'll also have controversy on this, because I agree he wasn't on the peace peace bandwagon per se before he died, but like at the same time, he wasn't exactly pro violence. So like when you say the end part of his life, that legacy is being overshadowed by the popular narrative that is pushed to help kind of filter through other agendas that have nothing to do with Black people and nothing to do with equality. Can you give like some examples of like what his rhetoric was like toward the end of his life? And then I have a couple of examples, but I'm curious like the ones that you're referring to, because I hear people say that all the time. And like in my research, I've been like, I haven't seen that hard hitting thing. So what is being overlooked?
Yeah, so in the historiography, especially when white folks are trying to capture our heroes and heroines, they always want to put a narrative that they want to put on it, and that goes with anybody. But like when you take Where Do We Go From Here, Community or Chaos, his last book, he was really, I mean, outright checking, you know, his white liberal brothers and sisters for them passing of the Civil Rights Act and bills like that. But at the same time, it's becoming more violent. I mean, we're getting more Black people getting killed um, after we pass these acts. So this what he was, it's almost like a reflectionary piece. He's like, yes, I've advocated for this nonviolence, turning the other cheek, and we've made a little bit of progress, but this progress has had this tremendous white lash that has caused many Black people their lives, even more so during this kind of settled, calm, kumbaya uprising that we've had. So all these liberal white folks and everything that was once with me, on the bridge and marching and everything, how come we're not? Where did they go? Where did that support go? And then you have, young Black leaders like Kwame Ture saying, no, we got to make the switch to Black power, and we have to be more aggressive and more revolutionary. And Dr. King, although he didn't agree wholeheartedly, but he started to listen and understand why they would think that. So again, but this is something that we don't talk about. When Dr. King said, I think I've taken my people into a burning building of integration, these are something we don't talk about because he's actually reflecting on, this is not where it is. And when Dr. King starts saying that, Black is beautiful and everything in the language, right? Everything white is pure, everything in Black is heinous and sinister. When he started talking like that, that's really closely resembles Malcolm X and other radicals at the time, we don't hear about that. Another thing we don't hear about Dr. King is even though he may have been nonviolent, and he had people like Byron Rustin, who was heavily influential in him, and we know all Byron Rustin was openly, gay male, right? He did a lot, and we may disagree, or some of us may have issue with his lifestyle, but there's a lot of things that he did during the civil rights movement that was very, very positive. Although I may not agree with his ideology, his thoughts and ideology as far as civil rights in some regards, because he was really the one that really pushed Dr. King to the civil rights. I mean, to this nonviolence particular framework. But we also have to consider there are people around Dr. King that weren't nonviolent. Dr. King wouldn't have been alive as long as he was if he didn't have violent people around him. Deacons of defense. I mean, there's a book called The Civil Rights, this nonviolence stuff will get you killed. I mean, so there are people talking about this, who actually had guns and arms and everything that were willing to put their lives on the line and go head to head with white folks at the time. You know, you look at Robert Williams, Negro with Guns, him and his wife, right? You had the sisters who were armed, you know, in hand to hand. And so these are things we don't talk about when we talk about Dr. King, but these were things that, you know, he definitely reflected upon and he said. So,
Can I
go ahead.
can I ask a question and give some pushback? So when I hear about that later legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, about a year before he died, he was on 60 Minutes, right? And I'm sure a lot of people have heard that quote that a riot is the language of the unheard. That's where that quote comes from. It comes from that 60-minute interview. But he said some other things in that interview that I just want to address because his outlook on violence is somewhat problematic to me. So he's known for that quote, right? A riot is the language of the unheard. But then, like, he goes on to say, he says, I would say that every summer we're going to have this kind of vigorous protest. My hope would be that it will be non-violent. I would hope that we could avoid riots. And this is what he says, because riots are self-defeating and socially destructive. I would hope that we can avoid riots, but that would be as militant and as determined, but that we would be as militant as and as determined next summer and through the winter as we have been this summer. So I want to couple that, his belief that at least in the form of a riot, right? Which to me, revolution is a form of a riot, but it is a riot with a purpose that extends outside of your neighborhood, right? Because I do agree. I don't like when we toss our own communities, because you have to wake up to that damaged community. I don't mind riots, but I feel like you should go tear up somebody else's community so that when they wake up, they feel some kind of way. But outside of him saying that riots are self-defeating and socially destructive, and mind you, this is just a year before his death, but that he understood that it was the language of the unheard, he also goes on to discuss how rioting and these acts of violence, he said, they may be deplored, but they are there and should be understood. Urban riots are a special form of violence. They are not insurrections, which is problematic for me, okay, that he said that. They are not insurrections. The rioters are not seeking to seize territory or attain control of institutions. They are, which again is problematic for me. They are mainly intended to shock the white community. So then he says, even in Black violence, they're not really trying to have a revolution. They're just trying to get white people's attention. And I wonder, like, is this true? He goes to say they are mainly intended to shock the white community. They are a distorted form of social protest. This is why I have a hard time with, like, Martin Luther King, even in his late life. Like, what he's saying right now is, like, insane to me. He says they're a distorted form of social protest. The looting, which is their principal feature. Now, mind you, he's on 60 Minutes. This man is on television. The looting, which is their principal feature, serves many functions. It enables the most enraged and deprived Negro to take hold of consumer goods with the ease the white man does by using his. Often the Negro does not even want what he takes. He wants the experience of taking. So when I look at that, and mind you, this is a year before he died, and then people say to me, well, became pro-violence at the end. I have to where he says he understands why it went on, but that it is not an insurrection. It's only meant to get white people's attention, that it is only engaged in by the most deprived of the Negroes. You know, when he's talking about how, you know, that it's self-defeating. So to me, if in one breath you say that a riot is a language of the unheard, but in the next breath, you're calling it socially destructive, you're calling it self-defeating, you're calling it not basically a revolution, it's not an insurrection, nobody wants land, nobody wants anything but the white man's attention. And then you sit on national TV and say that, like, I feel some kind of way. So then how do we reconcile that when we're talking
Well,
about speaking like this on TV a year before he died?
well, here's what I will say to that. I definitely wouldn't have said it on national TV, but as I was listening intently to what you said, really, if we're honest, what did he say was, what did he actually say was wrong? I mean, if we really think about it, when a lot of people protest, I'm talking about in current times, contemporary times, they're usually doing it for shock value. They're usually doing it, and see, this is so he actually probably was probably prophetic in saying that because again, the context and the way he delivered and everything, again, I may take some issue with it. But based upon what has happened when these protests, they're just protesting the protest. And a lot of times we do tear up our own communities. We do loot. We don't need the stuff. We're just taking it. What does it lead to? So we're not actually doing stuff to say, hey, we are making demands and everything. I mean, I'm actually saying, so when we go on the freeways to stop traffic, what is the purpose of that? I mean, I'm talking to a lot of young people here, so please chime in. When you are protesting, are you playing checkers or are you playing chess? I mean, so what is your long-term plan? What is your long-term strategy to actually get something accomplished? And again, as I'm listening to you with all due respect, what he just said was true. And I know a lot of people, older people in the civil rights, they say a lot of the same things. Oh, you shouldn't protest. You should do that. We're only tearing up our communities and everything. And my thing is, we should have a right to, but I'm actually, what is it going to lead to? So if you're protesting and everything, or you're making demands and it's strategic, I'm with you. But a lot of the time it's just for shock value. A lot of the time we're just wearing the hood, we're wearing a t-shirt, we just want to get on the news and say, oh, did you see me there? I was protesting, and at the end of it, it's done. So if we really,
where does he advocate violence? I only hear him saying he understands why they are violent, even though the violence is misdirected, it's unfruitful, it's not about anything. They just want your attention, white man. So my thing is, when does this advocation of violence come? Because I haven't been able to find him advocating violence. I've only been able to find him speaking like he did there, which is where he's like, I understand it, despite the fact that it's pointless, despite the fact that it's not what I really want. I get that they're doing it because they're frustrated. I couldn't see him moving past that. Like, I couldn't see him. I've not seen anything from him that was anything more than an acknowledgement that he understood the reason behind the violence. So I agree with you. I agree that our people tend to tear up their own neighborhoods, which is dumb to me. I don't care what anybody says. That's stupid. Like, even if you were going to riot, like, go tear something else up. When you wake up in the morning, your neighborhood should not be the thing that's destroyed. It should be somebody else's neighborhood. So I agree with that. I agree that it's not revolutionary violence, right? So nobody is attempting to do anything but get somebody's attention. I agree with all that. But then my thing is that if we say that his later voice is being shadowed out by his earlier voice, but his later voice says, I still don't want people to be violent. I see why they're being violent, even though it's only the most enraged and deprived of the Black people that's doing it, even though what they're doing as far as being violent is self-defeating and socially destructive, even though it's not an insurrection. When he says all that, then my question is, because a lot of people said that to me today, and I'm just wanting this to be qualified. When was he militant? Like, because I'm not getting the militantness from that,
And so here's what I said. Dr. King never became like pro-violent. I said he became more radical. And what I mean by more radical is that he didn't only speak of this kumbaya, white women, children, and holding hands and everything. He stopped talking so much about integration, and he started looking more at economics. Okay. And so, when you start talking about economics, That's a radical conversation. That's a totally different radical conversation than, just trying to eat in your restaurants and everything, instead of like, oh, we need to have our own restaurants, we need to have money, we need to look at um, um, wealth distribution, right? Looking at economics, looking at the wars and stuff like that. That's a totally different orientation. Um, Before, he was solely talking about kumbaya and turning the other cheek and learn and loving our white brothers and everything, despite all this. Again, he didn't, like you articulated, and just say, okay, now we're gonna pick up arms and everything and start just, you know, going mafia style in a revolutionary manner, and just go from nonviolence to pro-violence. He never said that. I think fundamentally he still believed in nonviolence. I think he was questioning it. I think he was being more reflectory of it. He had more reflections, but I don't think he ever truly articulated anything that you're trying to see that he did, because he never went that route. But again, when I'm speaking of more revolutionary, he wasn't all this kumbaya. He was more critical of the United States. He was more critical of the economic structure. He was critical across the board. He was more critical of those white liberals that, again, he was once locked in arm with. And again, once you start being critical, especially about the economics, we got to do something with you. Because it's okay when you talk about integration and everything, because nothing's going to change when you integrate. I mean, when you have a second thoughts about Brown v. Board, right, and how that did more harm than good, yeah, you could be reflective of that, but that's fine. But when you're talking about getting monies, so now we can have our own schools, so now we can have our own business, now we can do the things and everything that we need to do, because we know that this assimilation, this integration, this is not going to work for us. So when you start having kind of like those thoughts, right, then I think that's way more revolutionary than his earlier rhetoric.
Do you think that his change of mind on this was affected by the fact that when integration happened, it was Blacks being integrated into white spaces, which meant that the Black businesses that grew and were supported by Black communities because they had to be segregated, then were shut down in favor of moving those bodies, moving that money, moving that human capital, and moving all of that industry into white spaces that then gobbled up this thriving Black economy that was being built because we had no choice but to build it. So do you think that he saw that loss and then was like, oh, what did I do? Because what ended up happening is that we lost all our stuff so that we could be a part of their stuff. They didn't integrate our way. It wasn't a two-way integration. It was, you guys give up all your stuff. You give up your schools. You give up, you know what I mean? Your bus lines. You give up your stuff. And then you come over here and participate in our thing. Bring your money over here. Bring your business over here. Bring your kids over here and participate in our thing.
Yeah, I definitely think that Dr. King saw the interest convergence for white folks. And what I mean by that, they saw the interest. They saw like, hey, if they come over here, we still could profit. We still could look good, especially in the world, right? Because again, everyone's looking at this. Russia is looking at this, say, hey, Black folks, if America's treating you like this, come over here and become communists. So they're looking at all these things, and people have written about this, right? You have Derek Bell, one of the fathers of critical race theory. You have W.E.B. Du Bois, who's very complex, saying these same things like, hey, why should we do this? I mean, they're even questioning the fact that when we look at a Brown versus Board, why they even did it. So again, there wasn't any altruism associated with that. It was like, how do we look politically? How do we look globally, right? So again, let's do something about this. So I do think Dr. King took that into consideration, but I also think he looked at this, that, and more importantly, he looked at the fact that brothers and sisters were being slaughtered left and right. I mean, so after these bill passed, these law passed and everything, the situation became worse. How's that supposed to happen? you know, we're supposed to see a decrease in the violence. We're supposed to see an increase in the love and the camaraderie and the mutual respect and the admiration for each other, you know, looking at people's character, right? And not the color, right? We're supposed to see more of that. But what he saw was the opposite of that. He saw the the decline of humanity and the increase of brutality, right? And he's like, whoa, 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 whoa. So this is the reflective part. Then he started looking more holistic, like, oh, this has an impact on our economics. This has an impact on housing. This has an impact on all these different things. And yes, race is still an issue. But again, he still remained in that non-violent framework. But again, I think he was more under an understanding of why people were like, this non-violent stuff will kill you.
Hey, Carl's opinion, and thank you. I appreciate that. I don't know why I'm not seeing you guys in my chat. Carl said, "Where did the white people go who marched with me? You," he put that in quotation, "scared them away. Martin Luther King and Andrew J. Young versus BLM, kind of like Nelson Mandela versus Julius Malema." I can't say his name. Can you say it, babe?
No.
Julius Malema? I think that's how you say his last name. Heck, you even got white women to vote Trump. I can't. I will say this, in kind of the spirit of what Carl's opinion was saying, and thank you, Carl's opinion, how have the liberals taken the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King to push a liberal agenda? Like, we talked a little bit about what you witnessed, but can you speak a little bit more on how they've co-opted Martin Luther King's holiday to push their liberal agendas?
Well, yeah, they've co-opted, they politicized it. How have they been able to do that? Is I think you look at Black folks, are just being very fickle, right? Just being impressionable of these white folk who come in and speak the language, the current language of equity, equality, and inclusion and diversity. They drop all these buzzwords, and Negroes start to feel really good and warm inside and everything. Oh yeah, they get me, and they really love, especially when white folks, i.e., like a Tim Wise type of person, comes out and speaks. They have this rhetoric, right? And so these type of things make it easier to hijack and co-opt these particular movements or these particular celebrations, because again, it's a subtle shift from Dr. King and what he was advocating for the end of his life, right? During the later parts of his life, towards, I really want to talk about what I want to talk about. And I'll throw just some quotes in about Dr. King and that ooh and ah, the crowd and everything, because we don't read, or we don't read them and what they're actually there to do. Because I look at these folks and I'm like, well, you could come out to a Dr. King event, but you can't come out to a common school event. You know what I mean? Now, granted, this is the day, it's a federal holiday and a lot of people are off, and so they're able to move around a little bit more so than usual. But my thing is, if it's of importance, right? Not of a symbolism, but if it's of importance, you're going to be there. And say a lot of times these people go there to be recognized, to be seen, and not to go there to put in the work. And so what we have allowed people to do is just get away with coming and sounding pretty and charismatic and having a nice suit on and what have you, and saying some things, and people going oh and ah, and then they leave and everything is still relatively the same, or sometimes it may even get worse. So How are we allowed to do this? I think we've been too fickle. We've not challenged anybody. We've not challenged anything. We've not, you know, asked a question, to these politicians. Well, why is the employment rate, lower than it's been in years? But when we look at the discrepancy between black and other ethnicity, we're still ours is still the highest. I mean, when we start asking some really pointed questions about, okay, why is it that, when we look at the discrepancy and disciplinary infractions in the schools, where we're in a state where we only make up 2%, but we receive the highest amount of disciplinary infractions. Okay, and what are we doing about getting more teachers and retaining them that look like me and you, and who's on these boards, and who? I mean, so when you start asking questions like that, it gets quiet. They have a lot of fluff around it. So in a particular state where I am, there's a student success plan for black students, or there's supposed to be. There's even a House bill that's put forth to really ameliorate African Americans as far as graduation rates, discipline, attendance, so on and so forth, right? And I start to deconstruct this and I say, okay, well, what's going on? Because there's money associated with this, but how come the money's not going directly towards the improvement of student achievement and outcomes? And so, what are we doing about this? And people say, oh, well, we established a BSU here, a Black Student Union. I'm like, okay, that's great, that's good, but how's that helping students with their arithmetic, their academic achievement? How's that helping them socially navigate through the racism that they're facing every day? I mean, I have a litany of questions and there's no answers. I'm like, okay, so if you don't have any answers, I know how we could do this. And then everybody gets quiet. Because I'm like, if there's money to do this work, we could do this work, but they know how Black folks do. And what we tend to do, you could give somebody, say, oh, okay, I'll give you a contract for, let's say, 100-some thousand, and Negroes will sell out their own mama for peanuts, right? And so it's not a collaborative effort. And so I say all of to say this, that we allow the same type of things to happen over and over again, and we're just part of the spectacle. And so when I go, I'm always hypercritical. I'm like, okay, I see young brothers and sisters here, but where are they in this work? Are they doing the lights? Are they behind the scenes? Are they coming up? Are they emceeing? Are they facilitating? Are they getting the opportunity to question some of these politicians, in a way that they want to? I mean, and so we don't have that. We leave them voiceless, and the same thing happens over again and again and again. And when you have a captive audience like this, it's really the time to put them, kind of like we're on the spot, like, hey, yeah, you here now, but you're only here now for political expediency. You know what I mean? You're really now not here for any type of altruism. You're not here. And so again, this is a political year, right? And so this happens all the time. You have local politicians never step foot into a Black church or Black organization, but they'll come around now because guess what? They want your vote. And they're going to say all these things and promises that I'll do for you, instead of the other way around. You go into them and say, these are the demands that we that we need from you, or else we don't do it that way. And so that's why we're able to be co-opted. That's why we're able to have white guys, white young males, have a sign that says don't shoot and hands up, and nobody's appalled by that. You know what I mean? I was like, really, I just want to snatch the sign out of his hand, but I didn't want to assault, the young white guy. But I'm like, no one sees the problem with this, really? I mean, literally, that's problematic, because we have brothers that are just walking out of their homes and getting shot. Hell, we have people in their own homes getting shot, right? And you are going to walk around with this sign and everything. Like, who allows that stuff? I mean, somebody should have said, nah, right, you should have had a rainbow flag or something like that, or something, but don't have one of these hands up, don't shoot, or I'm not a threat. But again, this is what I'm talking about, how we're just okay with that. because I've never would have. I'm like, okay, do you think I'm marching with them? Do you think I'm co-signing this stuff right here? No, I'm not co-signing that. That's crazy. You know, just think about it. Just think about it. You think a Jewish person and they're talking about the Holocaust or in remembrance of that and everything, you think they will have a need to grow talking about I remember the Holocaust or something to signify that? They would chop his head off. Like you don't. This is not you.
Thank you. I'm glad you illustrated that point, because what he's saying about white men walking around with the "don't shoot, hands up" sign on them, it would literally be like it would literally be like the perpetrators of the Holocaust wearing a sign that has like the number of Jewish people killed on it, or you know what I mean? Like putting a fake tattoo where they have like one of those numbers that they use to number. Like it would be very insulting. But because they're liberal, they're able to engage in overt racism and it not be called out.
Yeah, like I said, I saw one of my colleagues and I was talking to her afterwards, and I said I almost threw up in my own mouth, and she said, "Oh, well, better get you near the trash can." And then I started talking to her later. She's like, "Yeah," and she had some strong words, and yeah. So it's just I'm really it's this cognitive dissonance for me because I love our people, and part of my job, I I gotta go to these events and everything, but I don't like going to events just to be seen and everything. I actually like to really go and be critical and connect with our young brothers and sisters. I mean, really, truly, that's why I like to be there. And so, I mean, I see, presidents of college and politicians and all them and everything. And I even spoke with our senator. But that's not what it's about for me per se. But I know for other people, it's about them, taking pictures with this person and posting them on social media and everything. And I'm just like, no. I mean, I generally sit in the back. I mean, I can sit up in front with all the dignitaries and everything, but I'm like, that's not what it's about for me.
I
Yeah.
have a question. So, do you think that the legacy of King, as it's been chewed up and spit out, is being used to promote cowardice and complacency in in our people?
Well, I think there's a lot of complacency, and I think there's, to a degree, a lot of us are cowards because we're so fearful of agitating or making white folks feel uncomfortable. And it's really sad that we go out of our way to make sure that you're comfortable, that the pillow has enough feathers in it, and that the temperature is at the, right, you know, right climate, is in the right climate. I mean, everything is just, their lemonade has the correct number of ice cubes. I mean, we really go out of our way to make sure white folks feel good. And we do that to really our detriment. I mean, so we're so concerned about the ways in which white folks feel that we're not even understanding that we're dying and being murdered. You know what I mean? So I often, let me say it like this differently. I always tell people when I talk to white folks in particular, I'm like, yeah, you may feel uncomfortable with I may share with you in the research and so on and so forth, but it can't be more uncomfortable than calling a parent, a black parent, and telling them that their son or daughter is never coming home again. And that kind of puts it in perspective, right? So your uncomfortability is nothing in comparison to the lives that are being taken, particularly young black males, right? And so I really don't care so much about your level of comfort. I care more so about our humanity and preserving of our lives, and not using them as hashtags once they're no longer living. Because a lot of times, and this is what Dr. Tommy Curry says, he's absolutely right. A lot of times we use the death of Black people as segues for conversation for white folks. And in my work, I try to be preventive. I try to get ahead of it. I don't want the death of a young brother or sisters to have that as, a conversation, to have this as, a conversational, intersectional point to now have with white people about how we need to do things differently as far as, this racism orientation, or police officers or white vigilantes or whatever the case may be. We have enough dead bodies to have this conversation from, unfortunately. So why do we have to wait to the next one? And when we wait to the next one, the conversation isn't nuanced, it's the same thing, and our actions are the same thing, are the same way. And so what do? We march, we have some t-shirts, we make some demands, we get some money, and then we shut up. It's the same thing. But we're not looking long term. We're not being strategic. We're not looking at the multiplicities of ways that we should be approaching these situations. We're just taking one approach. And one approach is that we're going to bring back Dr. King into this, is really looking at the civil rights approach. That same playbook, right? Using religiosity. You looking at our pastors, our faith-based leaders, and having them be the oracle voice for all Black folks. And again, I'm not condemning them. We need them too. But I think we just need a variety of voices at the table, and everything should be on the table as far as making sure we're being proactive instead of reactive.
I agree. I think we are reactive to a point. We're moved by passion, but we don't know how to move void of passion. So it takes something horrible to, and the problem with that to me is like, when you're moved by passion, but you don't know how to move without that catalyst, then the problem is the only time you feel compelled to do anything is when something egregious has happened. And then once you expend that initial burst of energy, once you have that visceral reaction, then you go back down, you simmer back down into a slow boil. And that is why we are not moving forward. I think, the way that the legacy of the civil rights movement and Dr. King's part in it is given to our children, I think it really breeds complacency. I think it really breeds a let's wait until they do the right thing kind of attitude. I think it really breeds cowardice, because there's a different, and that's what I was talking about earlier. Y'all already heard the rant. I'm not going to go on it again. There is a difference between being able to harm somebody, being capable and having the power to do them harm, and choosing not to harm them. We would call that mercy, right? Mercy is a type of nonviolence. And feeling that you are powerless to invoke change, and so you don't do anything. That is cowardice. And I think the line between mercy and nonviolence and cowardice is a very fat line that people act like they don't see. And we sit on the side of, there is nothing I can do to invoke change. There is nothing I can be successful at to really impact this. And if I try, my efforts will just be crushed because the people that have the power are greater and better. Therefore, I will be nonviolent, because any other solution is not going to turn. Like, all I can do is wait for them. Even in what King was saying in that 60 Minutes interview, I got the spirit of, and when he was speaking to his thought process and what he thought the thought process of Black people were, I picked up two things. Number one, hear us white people, like they just want you, because he's talking on 60 Minutes, right, to a white man. So he's saying, we just want you to hear us. So hear me when I tell you that all they want is to be heard. And then he said, all they want is to be heard. But then my thing is that Is that our legacy, right? That is where he reached in his understanding of where we are. And I agree with Mr. when he says, like, that is where people's minds are when they engage in rioting and they engage in these spurts of like passion, right? And outrage. But then the question is that all you want? Is all you want is to throw yourself on the floor like a child and have a tantrum and take that spanking if it's delved out to you without pushback? Or is what you want something greater than that?
Well, I think we are victims of wanting our 15 minutes of fame. We are victims of wanting to have our scholars go on MSNBC, CNN, so on and so forth, right? To go on these networks and really be the voice of Black folks. And so again, we know that's cachet, and that's ways in which to become famous and to make monies off the backs of Black folks. But are we really truly trying to have something systemic, something sustainable? And I think the answer, unfortunately, is no, because we could have if we really wanted to. But again, it goes back to what I said earlier about the chess or the checkers, because white folks and racism, white supremacy, alleged supremacy, again, they are playing checkers. I mean, chess, definitely. It's very strategic. You know, every move, there's a counter move. I mean, really way steps ahead of us. And we're really not, we don't really think that racism is that deep. That's our problem. we just think it's some interpersonal, prejudicial type of dynamic, right? We don't really understand that it's structural, that it goes into various dynamics, whether it's religion, whether it's policy, whether it's sex, education, so on and so forth. That it penetrates through all these different axioms, right? That is out there, but yet still we just think it's interpersonal, and that's our shortcomings of how racism works. We don't understand that this is an orchestrated effort. That this is racism is a team sport, right? We don't understand that, and that's our fault. That is our fault. And when we have conversations with need to grows and we show them blatantly, like, hey, this is not just, that one person that called you the N-word. You know what I mean? This is just not that one individual. This is a concerted effort. And then,
well, when you say that though, people go, well, I've never had a conversation with any about like holding Black people down. But mind you, you can play a game without there being a spoken, like, we're going to play a game now. People do that in their relationships all the time. Y'all are grown. You know how this works. You will be playing games, even though y'all didn't sit down and say, you know what, let's play a game with each other. I'm going to do this to see what you think, what you'll do. And you do this to see what I'll do. You may not have that conversation, but that doesn't mean that there's not a concentrated effort and intention behind what's going on. So that can work in a relationship, that can work in a greater relationship amongst large groups of people. And then in fact, there are just some things that are just blatant racism. But I wanted to throw this in there to because it spoke to what you're talking about. Carl's opinion said, how many unarmed Black people were killed by law enforcement last year? And in the chat, my response, and I would like your response to this, is not very many. Like, real talk. And in reference, in comparison to the total Black population, which is tens of millions, not very many unarmed Black people were killed by police. That's one measure. But then the other measure is per capita, in reference to other groups of people that the police encounter, too many unarmed Black people were killed, right? So it depends on the measure. But then it's always kind of the dog chasing its tail, right? Because here's the thing. We're not going to ever have, I seriously doubt, a time in this country where 8 million Black people are just going to get round up. 10 million Black people are just going to get round up. But we do have about 1 million of them that were rounded up and put in jail. And it's easy to work because 1 million sounds like a lot, right? when we're talking about prison, jails, all of these facilities, right? 1 million seems like a lot, but it's easy not to see that million in a sea of like 20 plus million people. It's easy for it then to seem like so much less. But do we have to, and this is just food for thought, Carl, I'm not saying this is what you were implying, but food for thought is, do we have to have something where you literally see half of the Black population being treated a certain way before we say that this is problematic? Is it not enough to see that a huge portion, percentage-wise, of the Black population is treated a certain way? Is it not enough to look at the per capita stats and say, man, if 1 to 2% of this population is ending up in a certain position, then that's actually quite a lot, especially if this is only happening at 0.3% to this population or 0.4% to that population. Well, that means that the likelihood of it happening to Black people is double. Well, then we have to have a different conversation. So I guess it just depends on the matrix. But what do you, what would be your response to that? Like you said, how many unarmed Black people were killed by law enforcement last year? That would kind of be my response. Not very many, depending on the metric you use, or too many, depending on the metric you use.
Yeah, I would say pretty much what you articulated, but I guess like what's behind the question? So, I mean, we're just asking a question. I mean, for the numbers, are we trying to illustrate, like you were saying, per capita, that there's the issue or anything? Because the answer is too many, right? I mean, that's the general answer. There are well too many. And then once we ask the question, okay, what are we going to do to try to resolve this issue? Because again, we ask a lot of questions, and we should ask good questions and everything. And once we ask these questions and everything, and we have our response and everything, and then it should get to the work of, okay, how are we going to resolve this? And again, they've had these conversations in different communities around police, implicit bias training, even in schools, right, where they're looking at teachers and how they're eyeballing, and particularly Black males, preschool and everything, giving more attention to them and them getting more harsh punishment, right? Punitive situations being handed out to these particular students. So we have this data. So that's.
Oh, well, I think he expanded on it a little bit more. Carl said, hold on, let me get to your Carl, what you said, Carl. Carl said, Ms. Yvette, you really don't want to go down the road of per capita statistics. More crime per capita equals more negative contact with law enforcement equals more per capita Black people killed. Okay, so let me address this and I want you to chime in on it too. So what I would say to that is this. I agree with you. I totally agree with you. However, I would say I agree with you with a caveat, and this is my caveat. I would have to add to that historically speaking, since the end of slavery, Black people have always been locked up more. And it's not because they have a higher propensity to commit crime. In fact, the variance, and I actually, there's a video. I have FBI, the per capita stats. I did a video on this. The variance is like 2% without respect for the fact that Black people are more likely to be arrested than white people for crimes. Without the respect, because remember, things are more nuanced than laying it out exactly as you said, Carl. When we have whole states, right? We literally right now have whole entire states with rampant, where people have contact with law enforcement but are not arrested or criminalized. When that is the law of a state with a population of maybe 0.5 to 1% Black or 5% Black, then what it means is that white people in vast parts of the country and whole states of the country have an opportunity to have non-conflict engagement with police officers by law. So although I completely agree with what you're saying, which more crime equals more contact and so on and so forth per capita, I would say that if only it had no nuances, we could make that argument. But when we know that we have the babies, the stepchildren of the broken windows theory, which specifically targets poor minority communities for police engagement. And we know that we have whole states where you have them overrun with a drug epidemic to the point where now they do not criminalize drug addicts, and they're taught by law to not be aggressive and to not arrest, right? Then I would have to say that then that picture that you painted becomes more nuanced, right? Because in order for what you said to be true, which I agree with, but in order for that to be true, there can be no nuances. That means that every engagement is because of a crime, and that no population is being engaged more than another population, and no population is given preferential treatment over another population. And I would argue that that is simply not the case based on facts, right? Based on states having engagement clauses for a particular sector, a whole state, or for whole communities being targeted because of who lives there. And we know these things to be true because these are things that were implemented into law, right? But we know that that moved into stop and frisk, and we know that that mentality that you crime is higher there.
You're breaking up.
In the oh, am I? Okay, well, why don't you take it since I'm breaking up?
You were.
Why don't you address that? Okay.
No, you stole my thunder. There's a difference between crime and criminality. And often Black folks are associated with criminality. Like there's a criminal gene associated with Black folks. And, there's always this racial subjectivity, right? And when we're talking about crime, and we have to look at it, I can't put it any more simple than this, who is determining what is a crime and what is not. So if and this is how it often works because the majority of the police officers are white, or even the police officers that are not white or of color or Black, they too, some of them, have this same sentimentality as far as this relationship between Black folks and criminality, right? And so what should be objectivity turns into subjectivity. In other words, we see, and again, Michelle Alexander says this in her book, The New Jim Crow, and all sorts of implicit data, biased data supports this, and what Irene just conveyed. It really boils down to this. If a police officer picks someone up and they want to say it's a crime, they're going to say it's a crime. If they don't want to say it's a crime, they're not going to say it's a crime. And oftentimes, Black folks have done the same type of things and have been arrested more and brought up on, oftentimes, trumped up criminal charges. And we know this is just the state. I mean, how many Black folks, and particularly Black men, have we seen over social media have been exonerated from being falsely accused of a rape in particular or something else that they never did, right? I mean, these things happen all the time. How many times do we hear of police officers planting, drugs and false evidence on a Black person? We see all these things all the time. But see, the problematic part of all this thing, the whole thing is that in society, it becomes believable. And let me tell you what I mean by this. So I forget the lady's name um, in North Carolina, where she alleged that, now this doesn't even make sense to me. I knew it was far fetched when I heard it. She alleged that some brothers carjacked her and took the kids. Now, this is North Carolina. I forget the particular case, but this was years ago. Now, the reality of the matter is she had a boyfriend and he didn't want kids and everything, and she drowned her own kids. But you could blame it on a white, you can blame it on a black male because it'll stick. It sounds like it's true. I mean, it's just like you throw the noodles on the wall to see if they're done, right? Once they stick, okay, it's good. The same thing with the other white guy. I think this was in Boston, and I forget the particular case. But again, he killed his wife, blamed it on two black dudes, right? And it caused such a racial uproar and in Boston and everything. The racial tensions was so thick, you would cut it with a knife, right? All these stories made up, but why are they so believable? That's the problem. Why are they so believable? Because society has already demonized black folks and they associated them with criminality. So what you're saying, like Irene said, is not wrong, but it has to have a lot of nuance if you're going to make that argument.
I know I've held you up for a little bit over an hour. Do you want to close out about now, or?
Well, yeah, I'll say this and then you could, it's your show. But I just hope when we are not only celebrating Dr. King, but any other black figure or any other figure for that matter, that we don't allow this type of co-optation from other folks and that we control the narrative of that particular person. And I think we have to be unapologetic in controlling the narratives of our heroes and heroines. And if people don't like it, hell, they don't have to like it. But they're going to put some respect on somebody's name. And again, you would not do this at a Jewish event. You would not do this at an indigenous native event and everything. And there's only certain places where people, particularly white people, are able to come and co-opt it and spin it with their narrative, and then for their own political gains for the most part. And again, I'm really not mad at them, more so than I'm mad at us for allowing them to keep doing this over and over again without putting a proverbial foot in their rectum and saying, no, it's not going down like that. This is how we're doing this. And if you don't like it, you don't have to be a part of it. But again, we're too scared to say that because we need those dollars, right? We need those sponsorships. We need this and everything. And so if we don't have that white philanthropy, it's not going to be as alluring. We won't have, the finger foods and the coffees from, whatever place, right? And so those are the things we have to be mindful of and start working with our folks who have a little money that can contribute to things like this, or people that could put, some money down on a monthly basis. And so therefore you're not, just depending on white folks for everything and just showing your teeth in front of them all the time, because again, you're so dependent upon them. That's what it boils down to. And I think until we get to that position, we're going to be in the same situation over and over again.
So I guess my closing thought on it is just basically that I don't trust liberals. I don't trust them at all. I think they're full of crap. I think they're some of the most racist people. We are always looking toward conservatives. We're always looking toward Republicans. You guys know I lean heavily conservative. We are always looking toward that side of the aisle for our racists. But honestly, the liberals are the worst. Honestly, if a conservative group pulled what went on at that march today, it would be all over the news. It would be called racist and everything else. But because they're liberal and they're out there with rainbow flags and they're out there talking about suffrage and all these things that have nothing to do with Martin Luther King Day, because they're out there with their signs on. Because they're liberal, we cannot call them racist because the liberals are our friends. But I think we need to like definitely back up off of that and recognize that liberals will use Black quote unquote causes to push their liberal agenda. And it stops being about any message other than their message and them being able to integrate their agenda and basically take over the movement. I mean, we saw this with Black Lives Matter, which I'm not a fan of, but we saw that kind of taken over by the LGBTQ. I don't know what they're called. They're calling it, they changed their freaking name again. And I can't keep up. I just refuse to keep up with this acronym number thing that they're playing. But when these ++22 people, you know, co-opted that, like we see this happen time and time again, where they do the bait and switch. And so we see the liberals playing this game every year with MLK. I will also say that I would caution you guys to take the narrative of MLK that is taught in schools and not embrace that to the point where you literally think cowardice is appropriate, or you think inaction is appropriate, or you view inaction as action. Like, we have to tread lightly with these terminologies in these conversations. And we have to learn to have passion and fire, unlike what Martin Luther King described, because he described it accurately, even though it was uncomfortable. This kind of self-destructive, you know, unpurposed, out of the belly of your anger type of visceral reaction is fruitless. And so we have to definitely move away from that and learn how to channel energy in ways that are actually productive and help our community progress. And I guess that would be my final word on it. And yeah, so with that said, y'all, I am out of here.